Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am very excited for this week's guest, and I just want to tee it up real quick before I introduce Matt. But I'm a big believer that industrial real estate and even commercial real estate more broadly is only worth some function of what a tenant is going to pay to occupy it. So we spend a lot of time looking at industrial real estate and talking about the different asset classes. Sorry, give me 1 second here. I got to turn something off. That is I'm a big believer in that. And instead of just talking about the real estate itself, I've asked Matt to come on and talk about industrial real estate from the user standpoint. So Matt has experience all over the world. In the bio, you'd have seen that he's consulted and worked in different markets all over, speaks Spanish and German. So I might ask him to do a shout out to our anyone that's listening that speaks Spanish or German at some point in this call. But what I also want to do is I want to just get Matt to explain what his role as a supply chain and logistics expert is, just to familiarize people with what that role entails. So first, Matt, thanks so much for joining me on the call. When you have a moment, please introduce yourself and speak about your role as a logistics and supply chain expert.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. It's wonderful to be here. Like you said, a little bit about my background. I've been managing international operations now or been in the logistics role of some capacity, supply chain role for about 15 years. So right now, what I'm involved in primarily is a role that involves essentially managing daily operations for warehouses in China, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, and then also in the Netherlands and in Germany. And at one point, I was also managing a warehouse in Canada, in Toronto area, which is kind of in your neighborhood.
Yep.
And then also here in Indianapolis, which is another big logistics hub here in the United States. So I've had the experience to see, and at one point also Hong Kong, by the way. But so that's given me a broad perspective on global supply chain and kind of the geopolitical things involved and the effects that we see, tugging and kind of that the strain we've seen recently with supply chain, the effects that we see backed up all the way to Southeast Asia, all the way to this country. And so it's what my role entails is really my day in and day out is managing daily operations of the warehouses located in those countries I just mentioned and making sure that things work efficiently within the four walls of those warehouses to get everything in, stored correctly, and then out to the consumer or to the distributor or big box store on time and within those expectations of when they want it. So that's my primary role right now. In the past, I have gotten involved in the ocean freight aspect, the freight aspect, whether it be small parcel, LTL, FTL, which is less than truckload and full truckload. I have a little bit of experience in air freight. So I've had it's been nice to be able to see kind of all aspects of supply chain throughout my career. And so that's what I'm currently doing.
Well, yeah, you've got a breadth of experience, so this is going to be exciting to dive into a few topics. And just as an overview for people that are tuned in, first thing I want to discuss is just the process of site selection. So how a company goes through the process of identifying what markets they need to be in and what they're looking for in that regard. Then we'll dive into, once they've decided what market they want to be in, how they actually determine what warehouses are going to serve their purposes. And then, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, even just how supply chain is impacting the industrial real estate market as a whole and some of the trends going on there. And then I'd also invite anybody that's joined in live, if you have any questions for Matt, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. Hopefully we get to them all. And if you want to put any in Spanish and German, then we'll test to Matt's multilingual skills as well. And so, yeah, please feel free to put in any questions into the chat, but I will jump into it by site selection. How does a company, and it can be a 3PL, it can be a company that manages their own distribution. How does a company first decide what market they even want to be in? And I guess you could answer this from a standpoint that they might need to be in multiple markets, or maybe they're just expanding and they want to add a single one. You can choose how best to answer that question based on your experience.
Yeah. So based on my experience, I'll answer it that way. It really comes down to, first of all, supply chain is very big and very broad, right? It's incredibly complex, incredibly deep and broad. So what that means for every company is going to be something different. And so in my experience for the companies that I've been involved with, what the site selection involves first is trying to determine right now, if you're international, first of all, you determine what country you're going to be in based on where your customers are. you know, just because you're in Europe, for example, doesn't mean you should be in every country. You have to determine what the best country is when you're in Europe, and whether or not you should be in multiple countries, et cetera. So, and the same thing in Asia, the site selection is based on something a little bit different. It's not necessarily based on the fact that because I'm in Southeast Asia right now in the Shenzhen area, close to the Yantian port. So that site is more of a consolidation warehouse where it's there for, basically we're bringing in product from different manufacturers, different factories, and it's basically there and stored there until customers come and pick up in full container loads, typically, to then farm out to Asia, Europe, the United States, et cetera. So there's different reasons for different warehouses, and it comes down to every company what that need is. Typically, what you're going to do when you're determining where the warehouse should be, you're going to be doing something that's called a center of gravity study. And so what that entails is, let's say you're in the United States, you're trying to figure out, where am I going to have a warehouse? Should I have one on the West Coast, maybe in the middle of the country, maybe the East Coast? And what goes into that is some different factors like, what ports do I want to use? Do you want to use Long Beach, let's say Houston, Savannah? Do you want to go to Norfolk on the East Coast? There's different pricing that goes into that. So that's a factor to consider cost-wise. And then you move into where you're going to if your warehouse is going to be nearer to your customers, what the labor force looks like in those areas and the costs involved for labor, in terms of where your 3PL is going to be, your partner, if you have an existing relationship with someone who is in that area as a 3PL. So there's all these different things that get involved there. And then also, as consumers right now, we've been trained, especially in the pandemic era, to want to get our goods as quickly as possible, right? So if I order from Amazon, I want that to come next day, maybe 2 days, God forbid 3 days, right? So what ends up happening is, to be able to do that, typically that involves having more warehouses with inventory spread out in more locations, okay? So then it comes down to each company to determine, do I want to have more warehouses in my network? Do I want to have, so that I can be closer to my end customer to get those goods there quicker? But that also involves more cost. And it also involves other complexities. For example, when you bring in product from Asia, let's say that's where it's coming from, you're going to have to do more complex forecasting if you have more warehouses, and you're going to carry more inventory, which adds more cost. So there's a very complicated analysis that is involved in those scenarios. And typically, if you don't have the resources internally, you're involving consultants to help you with something that complex, where they're drawing in all kinds of data points that I just mentioned to be able to put together studies that will tell you what the cost overall will be if you have one warehouse, 2, 3, and so on, to be able to determine what that looks like. Because right now, when you look at it, the freight, because of gas prices, now we're seeing fuel surcharges just going through the roof right now. So all those factors play in as you try to figure out, do I want to be closer? Do I want to be, further away, but it's going to take longer to get to my customer? There's freight costs involved, all that stuff. So it's a complex thing, and everything that goes into that will be basically specific to that company and what their needs are, and what their consumers and their customers are expecting from them.
Yeah, that's a great explanation in detailing just how complex that process is, because I think a lot of people that aren't directly involved in the supply chain industry just assume that it's a fairly routine process of having something come across the ocean, then gets put on a train, gets put on a truck, somehow it gets to your door. And myself, even being involved in this industry, I often forget just how many steps and layers of intricacy and complexity are involved in this. And I think you just detailed that very, very clearly. And your experience working in the Chinese market is also a good help and illustration on how complex this is, because you're dealing in a market where a lot of this stuff is manufactured and then it has to get across the seas, but you also live in the market where that actually comes into port. So you're really seeing both sides of this transaction, all the way from manufacturing to distribution.
That's correct. And what's interesting is to just see how complicated things got in the pandemic era, right? So it's led to inflation. It's led to all kinds of different cost pressures for all these different companies, which adds the complexity of everything, which also directly affects the industrial space as well. But when you look at what's going on in China right now, where they have more of a zero tolerance towards COVID, Shanghai has been shutting down, off and on now for a while. Yantian, let me give you this example. Yantian, which is one of the largest ports in the world, which is in the Shenzhen, Southeast Asia, Southeast China part of the world. What happened during the pandemic era is that you had this shutdowns happening in that area. Okay, so what that means is all of a sudden things got backlogged, backed up, and all the way backed up at one point, all the way to the factories. Right, if I can't ship things out, all of a sudden I got to stop making goods because I have nowhere else to put them because no one's going to pick them up to ship them out. Right, so all that stopped, and so what made that what complicated things was that during that pre-pandemic, you're looking at a scenario of where on average you're looking at anywhere from, you hear about $2,000 to $3,000 cost per container. Okay. Now, when all that stuff started happening during COVID, it was a supply and demand issue. There was a backlog issue, which also led to the supply and demand issue. That was a contributing factor to all of a sudden you have soaring prices of containers that exceeded $20,000. So that in itself created its own natural backlog because people said, I'm not shipping right now. I can't take that kind of price hit, that type of cost hit. And so what ends up happening is all those costs, though, for the people that were shipping and continue to ship, someone has to pay for that somewhere, right? I mean, that's a huge increase all of a sudden overnight for those containers to go up that way. And so that is an indirect effect or a direct effect, however you want to look at it, that now we're seeing, the effects of that on inflation and how that's added to that complexity. Now you're seeing complexities that are happening now geopolitically with the war in the Ukraine and Russia, what that's done to oil prices. Not many people realize this, but commodities right now are gone through the roof. And you've got nickel and wheat, which is those come out of that area of the world. People don't realize that. And then I heard the other day, I was talking to some Dutch counterparts, 50% of the lumber that is supplied to Europe comes out of Russia. So there's all these, and I actually had a meeting with a guy in the Netherlands on Monday. He was telling me that it was something like 90% of nails are manufactured in Russia. So this is affecting pallets. So the nails that get put onto pallets is being affected now in Europe. So it's all very interesting geopolitically how all this stuff is affecting gas prices, the prices of containers, which then lead to other issues. So there's all these different things and factors playing into it. Consumer behavior changed over COVID, where all of a sudden you're going to big box stores, you're going to the Targets or the Walmarts of the world, Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever it was for you, grocery store. All of a sudden, overnight, you're buying online, and so what that's doing is it's changing the infrastructure for the warehousing world and the industrial boom that we've seen happening right now, the unprecedented boom that we've seen. Directly affected because of supply chain and how these different consumer behaviors are changing and how that's contributing to, I need more inventory to house somewhere because I need to ship it from somewhere, which is a warehouse. And, all these different things are happening, which are affecting the industrial market, but there's supply chain issues that led to that, which is a complex thing, but it's interesting to observe and to realize what's going on there.
That's some wonderful insight. And I before we get into the other questions I had, I think I want to go down that rabbit hole of just how much impact this is having on the industrial real estate, because I think it is profound, and it's not over by any stretch, because like you said, consumer patterns have changed. People are a lot more familiar buying things online now, and anytime there's a shift to e-commerce, that's going to require more warehouse slack in that supply chain. So I guess the first question I have for you, being hands on the ground in China and then also seeing it in North America, we're still seeing delays at major ports, whether it's Inland Empire or whether it's New York. There's still massive delays there. It seems to be easing, but now we've got issues on the shipping side, on the China side, where, as you said, they have to shut down manufacturing for various reasons, pandemic being one of them. What does this mean for delays? Are we going to anticipate seeing further delays getting things from China to North America or other parts of the world?
I don't think there's anyone that can really answer that question because of so many. When you think about it, I was reading recently that there are about, on average, 12 companies involved typically to get something from, let's say, in this example, Southeast Asia, all the way to, let's say, a warehouse in the middle of the United States.
12 companies.
So on average, 10 to 12 companies. So that would involve, the factory all the way to vessels, containers, the freight forwarders, the brokers involved to clear things through customs, the regulations. I mean, there's so many things that go into it. it's a very tough thing. Even I was seeing the other day where people don't realize this, but about 50% of all air freight that is moved around the world is in the belly of commercial airlines. So those all were grounded during COVID. So it's hard to determine, in my example, by telling you all that, is that what we realized in the pandemic is that supply chain is actually very fragile. The global supply chain network is actually very fragile. And what happens is that when you have geopolitical issues happening or this pandemic, it used to be that the worst thing that would happen to the supply chain was really a natural disaster, a hurricane, a typhoon, God forbid, an earthquake, something along those lines. But once those were over, people recovered pretty quickly, and then we were going about our business, our everyday lives. But this was so long lasting, and so it affected everything globally, that everyone started to realize the chinks in the armor of what really was going on. And at one point, they were backed up. You had mentioned the ports. Something like 80 vessels were parked, out at sea, waiting to come into the port of Long Beach. And it was an unprecedented amount. And so there's all kinds of factors. It's a very political thing right now. It's funny. I was talking to an industry leader the other day. He's a great guy. He's written a lot of books about supply chain and everything. But we were joking about the fact that it wasn't too long ago that if I said to somebody, I'm in supply chain, they kind of look at you cross-eyed, like, what is supply chain? And then you kind of have to dumb it down and say, well, UPS and FedEx. And they'd say, oh, okay, now I know. But now if I say I'm in supply chain, everybody goes, oh my gosh, you must be busy. It's really complicated out there. Everybody starts to understand it better. But typically people associate supply chain with shipping, right? And so they don't really realize that there's that warehousing industrial component to it, which is a big part of it. And so, but in terms of us seeing whether or not this is going to improve or not, everything I'm reading right now is that it's going to continue through 2022, perhaps through 2023. We were seeing improvements coming out of the pandemic because stuff was opening up again, restrictions were lifting, things were getting better. And all of a sudden, before we knew it, this Ukraine-Russia crisis happened. And now we're in the middle of a geopolitical issue now on top of that. So when you look at the supply chain and how that's affecting even Europe, you have this major rail that goes through Russia from Asia. That's being, whether or not that's going to continue, that's kind of iffy. You've got flight patterns that go over those countries that are now having to be rerouted, which are adding cost to those flights or adding time. There's all kinds of disruptions that people don't realize that are happening in addition to the price per barrel of oil going up because of this. So there's all these tensions happening that are directly related to supply chain that we're feeling the effects of, the ripple effects, if you will. And so, we are trying to adapt and adjust to this as best as possible. People are trying to automate certain things that they didn't before. They're trying to make things more efficient. You hear things like people saying, I need my supply chain to be more nimble. Mm-hmm. You see people trying to reevaluate where manufacturing is located. So right now you have more of what's called offshoring. You got people manufacturing goods all over the world, but now people are reevaluating this stuff in boardrooms and saying, do I need to be doing nearshoring? Do I need to be now, you see that Mexico now, you see manufacturing all of a sudden is going through the roof in that area of the world again, because people are afraid to have this manufacturing so far away from home. And you're also starting to see people reevaluate whether or not I should have manufacturing in the United States again as well. But all that stuff takes time. It takes money. It's very expensive to re-coordinate and reorganize that kind of infrastructure. And so it won't happen overnight. It will take time. Things are improving, but we'll see, where things go. And right now, as you would know, interest rates are, we're getting hit with that, which is going to add complexity to this as well. I just heard the other day where they estimate that something is going to happen along the lines of anywhere from maybe even 6 times interest rates going up in this year alone. So that's going to bring its own set of pressures and own set of complexities to all this, because there is a financial component to supply chain, of course. In fact, when you read things about supply chain globally, they estimate that supply chain is about, they estimate anywhere from about 11%, a little bit more of global GDP is attributed to supply chain, which is a big, staggering number when you think about that. So we'll see where it goes. It's anybody's guess right now, but things are improving in some areas, and then people are trying to figure out what to do next with the other.
I just as a quick aside, I think you answered that incredibly diplomatically because I essentially asked you in a question which was impossible to answer. I wanted you to predict what's going to happen to the global supply chain when it's clear that it's a very complex topic. So you answered that in an excellent way. And interestingly, I'm doing a video that I'm going to put on Friday that talks about that reshoring or nearshoring topic, because there's that big merger that's set to happen between CP Rail and Kansas City Southern.
Yeah.
It's before the Surface Transportation Board for approval right now, but it's technically happened already. It's into a voting trust. It's the acquisition has happened. Once that happens, it'll be the first single line rail network that connects Mexico, US, and Canada. So for companies that are concerned about these delays and the complexities with it, they have the ability, like you said, this is very complex and it's going to take time and money to do it. But in theory, you can have lower cost labor of things made in Mexico, have a direct rail route that can go across the US and across Canada. So I think that there's going to be a very interesting development on that. It's going to change its flow of traffic. All this underscores just how complex it is. And the one point that I really like that you made on there is that people are just looking to adapt. They're trying to stay on top of the news. They're trying to stay on top of all these things that are developing, and as opposed to just being a victim of things that are happening, figure out what's going on, synthesize it, and then figure out the best plan to go forward. So I think that was a great answer on that. And maybe that's a natural transition to get into the warehousing side itself. So let's assume that a company's gone through the site selection, they've identified where their customer base is, all the other elements, they've narrowed in on one specific market. So it's time to start looking at buildings. How does a company then go into determining what size that they need, and then what are some of the important characteristics that they look for in the building itself?
So that's a good question, because once you've determined, like you said, where I need to be, the next question is, and this is where it comes down to, do you want to own and operate your own building, or do you want to partner with a 3PL who is kind of an expert in that area, has the infrastructure already around them to be able to basically, you move your goods in and day one, they're ready to go, right? So there's different cost benefits, pros and cons to both. Some people like the control of having their own warehouse and operating their own warehouse. And there are benefits to that. Whereas if you go with a 3PL, there are other benefits as well. The infrastructure being the main one. And the downside with a 3PL, typically what I hear is that because they're in the business of making sure that they make a profit and that they're running efficiently, which they should be, if they do anything that's, let's say, it's a rate structure, right? So if they do a special project for you, or if you needed them to go take pictures, let's say, of some inventory for you so that you can evaluate it, whatever the case might be that you're looking for them to do, it's going to cost you money, right? And so there's all kind, and that's a very high level, very simplistic way of describing that. But the other thing that if you've made that determination, you have to determine what is going to be your necessity within those four walls. Because if you are the other thing, the benefits, by the way, so I'm typically involved with 3PLs, so third-party logistics companies, right? So you have the big boys that are all over the country, and then you have smaller mom and pop shops or family operated warehouse or logistics companies that are more local to that infrastructure, that to that city. And so it just depends on what you need for your needs. But what I was going to say is, it comes down to also, let's say I've worked with Costco, Amazon, and those big box stores as well, and their requirements and their needs are extremely complex. Okay, in terms of what they need for labeling, when they need to ship, when they expect something to ship, what carriers they expect you to use, what trucks, et cetera. So you need to have a partner that can help you along those lines with their IT infrastructure, with their systems, to be able to manage that. It depends on what you need. I mean, in its most simplistic way, if you were to watch, let's say, Shark Tank, to take it the most simple way possible, you have someone saying, I invented this right here, and I have boxes in my garage. That's the most simple example you can think of what a need is, to be able to house something. I get an order and I ship it out to an end consumer, all the way up until where you see all the automation. If you were to type in to look what the inside of an Amazon warehouse looks like, for example, it can get very complex and it almost looks sci-fi-ish, right? So what you have now also, you and I talked about this last time, you have companies that need a lot of automation and robotics. That's where a lot of these companies are going now, in terms of, if they don't fully automate a warehouse, they're also looking at an opportunity to have cobots, for example, to take out, because right now what's happening, what we had with COVID, specifically within the four walls of a warehouse, is that now I've got labor pressures. So all of a sudden I got people staying home because they can't come into work. And that's a problem. The supply chain, the distribution network didn't stop. In fact, it continued more than we've seen in the past. And so now you're seeing people that were having to adjust in terms of, I need to keep operating efficiently and as quickly as possible. But I'm also facing pressures of, I just don't have people showing up, or they're sick, or they can't come to work, whatever the case might be. They were also competing with the government because of the incentives for them to basically stay home. So there was all these different pressures, which is leading people to down the path of automation, to cobots, to robotics, all that kind of stuff. What you hear a lot of people talk about is the future being robotics in the warehousing world. And what we were seeing was the conversations that were taking place before pandemic was that we were going to see something, they were estimating 10 to 20 years for there to be what we basically have seen happen in the last 2, and then let's say 5, in the next 5 years. It happened overnight because everyone was forced to, because of what was going on. So now you're seeing warehouses that, I have a friend in the development world. He was showing me a picture recently that there's a warehouse being built right now that's 100 feet tall, and it's fully automated. The aisles are like this wide. I mean, it's another world right now of where things are shifting. So it all comes down to what your needs are as a tenant, as someone who needs to partner with somebody. The other thing too is, when I go into an area to evaluate what warehouse works for me and what 3PL I want to partner with, what's important to me is to know what the infrastructure of that 3PL is in that area. So can they breathe with my business? And what I mean by that is, if my inventory swells and grows, and this has happened recently for me in a couple of different places, I need that 3PL to be able to grow with me. I need them to have other facilities that they can partner with, or that they have nearby that they can store that inventory in, so that I'm not figuring out what to do with all this extra inventory that is there for various reasons. Your business is growing, or whatever the case might be. My strategy for inventory has changed, and I want to have more safety stock, whatever the case might be, all the way down to all of a sudden my inventory shrinks, and I need to be able to have a warehouse, a 3PL that can do that with me. So those are other components and other things that factor into those decisions, which are extremely important to a lot of people. And then you get into, when you're evaluating a warehouse, for some people it's important to have, certain ceiling heights, or, certain amounts of the way they rack product, or, different things like that fall into place, as well as to what goes into the decision-making process, the rate structure, what I can negotiate, in terms of that component as well, which is always a big part of the decision-making process. So it's a complicated organism of coordinating and figuring out what works for you specifically.
You had so much in there that it just prompted a whole bunch more questions. I have so many questions for you right now. So first thing, Ron jumped in and said 3PLs make some great tenants. Ron is a lawyer, industrial real estate investor, and YouTuber based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And he puts out a ton of great content. So I'd really encourage people to check out his channel. I also saw Neil joined in, so I wanted to say hi to Neil. Thanks for joining in. Comment from Poppy Spitfire. Appreciate you joining in the comment. Adding a manufacturing facility or warehouse would allow me to be more diversified. Yeah, absolutely. I think that speaks to just how important that is to the whole supply chain on there. And we will dive more into that. First question, just for anyone that might be unfamiliar with a 3PL, and I know that we talked about that pretty high level. How would you describe a 3PL for someone that really didn't have any understanding of what a 3PL is?
Sure. Well, it can be, there's a lot of things that go into that definition.
I'm just asking you all these impossible questions to answer. That's the theme of today's interview.
I would answer it this way. For me personally, it's been a partner that I can go in. Let me take a typical situation of what I walk into, okay? It's someone who is an expert in the logistics area, who has warehouse space, that I can go in there and partner with them, and they will have the system infrastructure in place. So, for a warehouse, typically what you have in place, hopefully, if at least at the level we're talking about right now, is you have EDI components. So the electronic data interface, where when I drop an order to a warehouse, send an order to the warehouse, transmit one to the warehouse, it goes through what we call an EDI transmission. Okay. And so you have to have all kinds of IT components into that to make that function correctly, all the way into, if once the warehouse gets those orders and they're getting hundreds of orders, they need to know how and when to process those orders. And the guys on the floor who are picking and packing those orders themselves, they have their own way of doing that. They have the best, most efficient way of going through the warehouse, so that you're not trying to figure out, I go to this location and that one, and you're trying to do it on your own. There's actually typically the systems in place that they have, their guns, if you will, that they carry with them, those scanning guns and everything. They're telling them, or the cobots, whatever the infrastructure is that you have in that warehouse is directing you where to go next. Okay, so it's incredibly important for me to find partners that have that infrastructure in place, so that I can execute orders the way I need them to. And that's what 3PLs typically provide. Now, it depends on the 3PL, right? And where we are in the world and what we're talking about. I mean, in the United States, if I'm shipping to the Amazons of the world, well, I need somebody who can do that. I need someone who has the infrastructure system-wise to be able to manage that, and to be able to not only manage the inventory inside the warehouse and the execution of orders when they need to be executed, but also how they bring in carriers and when they bring them in to pick up the loads that need to go out, and when that happens, and on time. I mean, at month end, anyone who's in the warehousing business, month end can be a crazy time to try to get people to come and pick up goods and ship them out. And it's a big dance of trying to get that to happen. So having that local infrastructure where those warehouses, those 3PLs are, in contact with those different carriers is important. So that's different than when I'm in China, where I don't need, for us right now, it's not that I need that level of complexity, that I need someone who is very well versed in the area of regulations and customs. Mm-hmm. I'm in what's called a bonded logistics park in the Yantian area, which is roughly equivalent to what we call an FTZ in this country, or in Canada, which is a free trade zone. So I need someone who is well versed and has the right partnerships locally with the customs authorities and other people, government agencies, that can help me through a pandemic level of complexity that we were introduced to, where the customs regulations and everything going on during that time it's complicated. So and in that, you go to Europe, it's the same kind of thing. You have different regulations there because you're in the Eurozone, so you're trying to figure out who needs customs documents, who doesn't, what countries this needs to go to that have this regulation, that regulation. All those different partners come into play. So when you're overseas, it's incredibly important for me to have 3PLs that are extremely well established, that are bigger. I know I'm going to pay a higher cost, but it's worth it to me because they're steady, they're stable. I could write a book about this. We had a partner in Hong Kong who was not that they were a more cost-effective option. And we literally paid the price because of that. And so we learned our lesson at one point that it's better in those areas of the world to go with 3PLs that are much more established and have the infrastructure that can help me with all these different complexities, which is a little bit different in the United States, where I can go with a smaller shop, the smaller 3PL, a more local 3PL who can provide what I need. And I don't need to worry about some of those regulatory things that are affecting me overseas. So all those are components depending on where you are around the world.
Yeah, a great answer. And to add to that as well, 3PLs occupy a considerable amount of warehouse space.
That's correct.
All over the world. And I think that's what people underestimate, especially as they get into the industry, is that they think of like the big names, like they think of an Amazon fulfillment center, they think of like a Home Depot distribution center. But in reality, there is a considerable amount of 3PLs that occupy warehouse space. So that's in large part driving the demand for all this warehouse space. It all ties back to the increase in e-commerce and the demand that comes from that all has to be satisfied by someone, and 3PLs account for a considerable portion of that industrial inventory. One question that I had that you brought up with automation and robotics is that automation and robotics is going to require a considerable amount of power to physically operate it. Well, capital too, but even outside the monetary issue, like just the electricity to power these robotics. For the most part, these warehouses weren't designed to have a considerable amount of power draw, because it's really, especially like the older model of warehousing, it's racks of storage. They might have like basic needs for lighting and maybe a few machines in there, but certainly not at the level where you're seeing full automation and robotics. And then also combined with that is that it's all the Internet of Things, where these are all require connectivity to the internet and broadband capacity. So and one of the things I wanted to explore with you is kind of the future of warehousing. And so I think that this ties into it naturally. How does this changing demand for warehouse space with more robotics, more broadband connectivity, how does that change the existing stock of industrial inventory that perhaps isn't compatible with that right now? And what does that look like going forward?
Well, I don't want to overstate the issue either. Supply chain can get very theoretical, and you have people that get out there very academic when it comes to this stuff, right? So you have a lot of people writing about it, but really what it comes down to is, yes, you have Targets of the world. And actually, my career started at Target. So, and this was 15 years ago, where the automation they had at their warehouse, which is nothing like what you see now in the warehouses today. Back then it was like, oh my gosh, it was blowing your mind, right? But so, you have those extreme examples of the people who have the capital, the infrastructure already in place to be able to, and when I say infrastructure, what I mean by that is, you have people that can invest their time, and the people can basically do the analysis that is involved to be able to know what that automation need is, what is involved financially. You have the labor to be able to to adapt to all those things. You have the infrastructure in place, warehousing wise, et cetera, and you have the financing, the financial backing to be able to do those big time investments. But not everyone is that way. I mean, when you're talking about, let's say, some local 3PLs, it's going to be very different than that. They might have more of a cobot scenario where their heavy investment is in more along those lines versus a fully automated, a warehouse that is full of robotics. And I think sometimes we think that it completely removes the human element of it, which I don't know if that will ever happen completely, but so it is happening. There is a drive towards automation. There is a drive towards more robotics. But, where the day where we see all warehouses go down that path, where we see everything going in that direction, that I think is going to be a very, very long time. I think in the meantime, what we're going to see is people taking kind of steps in that direction. And what you're seeing right now with the industrial real estate is that, for the most part, warehouses continue to be built pretty similarly to what they've been built in the past, right? So there might be more robust networks in place for what you were talking about, for the need for better IT systems and things of that nature, But so yes, there are the 1.2 million square feet, and I saw at one point that Amazon had this warehouse that was something in the line millions and millions of square feet. Yes, you have those scenarios where they are that level of automation, but so I think that some of that is overstated. Circling back with the academic piece, I think some of those things are a little bit more theoretical. I think practically, though, some of these companies are a little bit more traditional in terms of how they're approaching their supply chains and their warehousing.
Yeah, and that's a very excellent point to bring up from the academic side, but not even just from an academic side, but even just from like a human interest side, or maybe a robot interest side, is that people are always going to be drawn to a headline that's sensational, right? So if you can imagine the short narrative or soundbite of you clicking something on your computer, a robot makes it in China, sends it by driverless truck to the port, a driverless cargo ship takes it across the sea, driverless truck brings it right to your house. That all of a sudden is going to get people's attention versus somebody toiling away in China and then going through the traditional network of somebody driving it to your house. People are always going to be intrigued by what this potential is, the sci-fi world of a robotics warehouse. So I do agree with you on that, and we're still seeing it. Like all the warehouses underway in our market, I think there's more of a sensitivity to increased power, so people are taking that into mind, kind of future-proof the building. But these are still like you're seeing 36-foot clear ceiling heights, maybe going to 40 in some markets. You might even see the odd multi-story building, but they're not being designed for this advanced sci-fi
Right.
world where it's
Correct.
all robotics for the most part. There's the odd building that's doing it, but to your point, these are companies that can put in $100 million worth of
Correct.
robotics. The average company can't make that type of
And
investment.
that's the important thing to think about all this, is that it's nice to think about. And I'll give you an example. Look, I visited factories in mainland China that are, I mean, it's like going back in time, and yet they're manufacturing, some products that it blows your mind that they are being made in that kind of level of a facility, right? So, and by the way, I tell people, a side note here, the fact that something gets manufactured in mainland China, hours from the nearest port, that's not always the case, but let's say that's the case in this scenario for the factory I visited, and then it ends up at some point in your front door, at your front doorstep. It's like a miracle of life, It's like the steps involved to get it there. It's really amazing when that takes place. But that aside, you have the extreme examples of, you kind of feel like you're going back in time all the way to, I visited the port of Rotterdam, which is an incredible port where you have all this automation happening with driverless chassis, essentially moving containers around. And what we were told about is that the people that are operating those chassis are essentially offsite in a similar kind of room that you would expect in like an air traffic controller type of scenario, where it's almost like a video game where they're controlling, these chassis moving around the port. So that there is automation out there that is impressive. Okay. But it's not everywhere. And it's going to take time for that to happen on a larger scale, where the investment and the capital is there, the financing, the financial backing is there to make that happen, right? So, and when you take it a step further, when you look at these ports, for example, in this country, and I don't know how it is in Canada, but this is to kind of give you another example. A lot of these ports are controlled and operated locally by the local cities, right? They're not a federal thing. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, it goes back to the financial backing in the local area and what they want to do and how much investing they want to do. So all those things play in a factor to this idea of what does the future look like with, this, like you said, almost like sci-fi, movement. But when you actually look at the shipping environment as a whole, or warehousing, really it hasn't changed as much as people think, for many, 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 many decades. I mean, the container was invented somewhere in the 1960s. Things haven't really changed as dramatically as people think since then. And so there are moves in the direction that we're talking about towards more AI and more robotics and more automation. But I think it's going to be many more years before we see everything be that way at the scale that I think sometimes people talk about in articles.
Yeah, great point. And interestingly, I'm reading a book right now called The Box, which is about the shipping container invented by a guy named Malcolm McLean, or the concept was invented by him. And you're right, it's pretty new, and it hasn't changed. That was groundbreaking. Like that changed everything. That the invention of the storage container, but it hasn't changed considerably since then. But I mean, there's always going to be evolutions and the next iteration, and it always will look different than it did in the past. But I think, just as an observation, I think that really underscores how imperative it is for people in real estate, and I suppose even generically in business in general, is that you need to stay on top of all these trends and all these developments. Like you see some kids coming out of university and they think they can wipe their hands on having to learn anything else. They just spent 4 years and they just want to get into the workforce. But I think it's a lifelong commitment to having to stay on top of all these trends, whether it's on the supply chain or industrial real estate side, just because things can move fast. And if you're not prepared for it, you can make a mistake that you otherwise might have caught.
Yeah,
so
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is one thing that I've observed too, somebody mentioned 3PLs on here. The other factor of this too is, well, the 3PL has to pass that cost on to someone, right? And typically that's their customer. So if my rates are going to go up because the 3PLs are investing in that type of infrastructure to increase automation, I'm typically challenging them to find ways to reduce my costs in other ways, right? So their costs are going up. We'll find a different way for you to reduce my rate or the cost in your operation so that my rate doesn't go up, because If things continue to operate correctly for me and efficiently for me, then the fact that this is better for you, you've got to prove to me why I need to now have a rate structure that is different and that costs me more money, right? So if that's going to be more efficient for you and it takes out waste in your operation, well, then I should not be penalized for that, right? So there is that kind of that push and pull, that tension, if you will, of the push towards automation, but also how do you keep costs under control so that I'm not, where my customers aren't, me with a 3PL, I'm the customer in that scenario, so that I'm not being negatively affected by that push towards, these developments in that area. So there's a lot that goes into it other than just, let's talk about automation and implement it. There's all those different types of levels that go into that are at play when you talk about that.
Yeah, and on that cost side and with increases, I mean, that's going to be a major development in 2022. The numbers just came out for CPI this morning. It was 8.5% year over year. And some economists are thinking we might even get into double-digit increases year over year as we come into the summer. So, I mean, inflation is going to be a key thing to watch this year, and that's closely related to interest rates. So, I mean, there's so much at play. Like 2022 is not going to be a boring year, that's for sure.
Yeah. And people are predicting there's going to be stagflation. So It's going to be very interesting to see what happens. People say that based on history, we should be heading in that direction towards a recession, stagflation type of scenario. So that's all making it very difficult for people to predict what the future holds, right? I mean, we were all kind of gearing up for this incredible recovery. And then, like I mentioned, then you have this geopolitical war happening that's having all kinds of ripple effects. And so it's all very interesting to observe. It's not all kind of in a vacuum, if you will, of what's affecting industrial right now. There's so much at play, these outside forces that play a factor into that space.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch. So I want to wrap up by getting just your thoughts on supply chain and industrial real estate, and I'll give you leeway to take it any direction you want. But I also do want to open it up if anyone has any questions for Matt. We've got about 13 minutes left or so, and I'm going to take every minute of that time to get more of Matt's insights. But if you have any questions for Matt on supply chain, industrial real estate, please put it in the chat. But back to the question I had, what do you see right now in the forecast? What does the industrial real estate landscape look like for you? What does the supply chain industry look like as we come in with all these unknowns? And again, I appreciate another impossible question that I'm throwing at you, but however you want to take it, just whether you have a hunch or whether it's something you're reading.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say this. I've had a lot of conversations recently with developers that would tell you that this boom that we've seen in industrial real estate that has been unprecedented, right? I mean, what you're seeing right now is they think and it's anybody's guess, but they're predicting right now, the people I've talked to, that this wave will continue for another 2 to 3 years, is what most people are predicting. And then right around year 5 from now, you're going to see things level out and then kind of get back to where we maybe saw things a little bit beforehand. But, right now you're seeing unprecedented, rents are, unprecedentedly high. You see square footage being added at an unprecedented amount. One of the guests you had on recently said that in the Chicago area alone, they're expected to add 20% of, in addition to what they have now, square footage in the upcoming years, which is a staggering amount when you think about that. So I think what the future holds is that right now the consumer behavior has changed forever, right? What the pandemic did was that we all went online and started to buy things online. And so the natural way of us wanting how we buy things is now just changed. And so the way that companies are reacting to that is what we just talked about earlier, which is the way I'm looking at my strategies for how I hold inventory, where it's housed, how close to my customers, all those types of things is changing. When you look at this during the pandemic era, something along the lines of 1/3 of the world's steel was being consumed by Amazon because of the warehouses they were building. It's a staggering amount, right? But then you read recently that they're starting to pull back on that strategy of the expansion that they've been undertaking right now, and they're going to start redirecting the money elsewhere, because they now believe that they have, the amount of warehouses they need for what they need right now. But now you read that Target is implementing a different strategy where they had a network that was in place, and they're now looking at expanding their network with additional warehouses. And they're looking to expand right now to be closer to their customers because of the very thing we talked about I need to be close to my customer to deliver within a certain amount of time. And to be able to do that, I have to be closer to them, which requires more warehouses. So you're going to see that expansion continue. You're going to see that growth continue, at least for a couple of years, because it's adapting right now to that new consumer behavior, to the new way of how I'm managing inventory. So that's going to continue for a little while. And so the ripple effect from that will continue to be, the supply and demand issue, which is, the rents will remain probably high or go higher. It's anyone's guess, but right now it looks like that will be the case. So you'll see that expansion, right? And so that's going to continue. In terms of supply chain, it'll be interesting to see. I think it's going to be interesting to see how long this war lasts. I just had a conversation with someone yesterday, actually. They were telling me that in Europe right now, the conversations being had is that this war will go on for 2 more years.
Wow.
Which surprised me. I thought it would not be as long as they were predicting, at least in Europe. That's what they're saying. This is a conversation I had with somebody in the Netherlands. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how everyone adapts to this new world of, I don't know if Russia the sanctions against Russia will go away anytime soon. If the war continues for that long, more than likely not. In fact, they could get worse. So how we all adapt globally to oil and other commodities, I think is going to be what determines some of the prices we've seen, which will affect, the price of freight, the price of trucking, et cetera. There's a lot of pressures right now on trucking companies here in this country. In fact, what you hear right now is that there are some of these trucking companies that are looking at bankruptcy. They can't keep up with the hikes in prices of the gas and of diesel. And so there's only so much they can do to pass on to their customers before it's a terrible ripple effect that we're seeing right now too. But I think that you'll see things in China ease a little bit over time. I think that right now in Shenzhen, where there's a huge amount of ports that are very, very large, as those things start to ease even more, I think that things there will get back to normal. In this country, what you're seeing is that Long Beach try to adapt with, this is a popular thing in the news over the holidays, but they started going to more of like a 24/7 shift scenario, where before they were working like, I think 19 hours, and they went to a 24-hour scenario. So they're trying to ease the backlog there. What you're seeing in the United States, though, is that in Savannah, for example, the local government realized that because the Long Beach port was so backed up, people were starting to reroute their containers to Savannah. Mm-hmm. So Savannah realized that, so they started pouring money into that area. The government, the local government, which is another reason why industrial took off in that area, is because infrastructure was improved. So rail, the ports were more busy, all those types of things, which now is giving more incentives to people to grow in the area of industrial in that space too. So what you're seeing is people adapting, and I think that's what you're going to see is more nearshoring, people bringing manufacturing back. You're going to see people adapting to things by using different ports, finding other more efficient ways of operating, finding better 3PL partners that suit their needs. So those types of things will continue to happen. And so what you hear, though, is that supply chain has changed forever, and there may never be a normal again, right? It might just always be some form of us having to figure out how to coordinate and adapt and be nimble to whatever's happening at that point in time.
Yeah, a great point. The one thing you mentioned on there about increased expenses for fuel, I read something the other day that Walmart is trying to attract truck drivers, and I think it was just in the Georgia area. I don't know if that was national. I skimmed the headline. It's one of those two.
Yeah, I saw the article. That's
read articles. Yeah, but they were offering $110,000 salaries, and again, I think it was just in that one area. But that's a giant company that now has to overpay labor. Overpay is probably a wrong way of describing it, but they have to pay extra to get truck drivers, and then they also have the added fuel costs on there. Right. And a company like Walmart can afford to do that, whereas a small company that now has to compete with Walmart and now has to offer similar types of wages to get truck drivers to work for them, and they also have to pay their expenses. There's going to be a lot of pressure on some of these smaller companies.
That's exactly right. And I saw that article you're talking about. And by the way, there is a global shortage of drivers. In Europe, they're facing it because the Ukraine war, or the Ukraine and Russia war, at one point there was something like 16,000 drivers were stuck in the Ukraine that were of other nationalities trying to get out of there. And on top of that, every man that is between the age of 18 and 60 has been required to stay in the Ukraine and fight to defend their country. So that took all of those drivers out of the market, right? So in this country, it's other forces at play. People are aging out of the market, driver-wise. A younger age group is not so keen to get into that job, and so you're seeing what Walmart is doing. I'm going to offer you more money to incentivize you to come and drive for me, and we'll see if that works or not, and whether or not that changes things or not. But yeah, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of things at play here, that are both affecting supply chain and then also affecting industrial. Yeah.
On a somewhat related topic, how far out do you see driverless semi trucks? Is that because they are on the road in limited capacities, but how long before that technology actually catches up where it can make a significant impact?
To be honest, I'm not as close to that as other people are. I'm more close to the warehousing side and in the industrial side, but so I don't know enough to really comment. I've seen presentations from different 3PLs that have presented and different freight companies presenting me with these options of, hey, isn't this great as a selling point? This is what we can do for you. And there's different reasons for it, by the way. What you have too is a scenario where there's kind of a truck following another one. So, it's one of those things where the second truck is driverless and, there's that kind of stuff. So there's all kinds of options out there as to what that looks like, but what the future holds for that specific example, I'm not really sure. I'm not close enough to know.
Yeah, and nor am I, other than just as like a layman trying to follow it. But what I suspect is happening is that the next generation of the workforce is looking at this and saying, well, driverless technology is increasing at a pretty rapid pace.
Mm-hmm.
So why would I spend time learning and the cost learning how to be a truck driver when there's technology that could displace me as a worker? So I'm sure that that's contributing to an aging workforce in the trucking industry, with the next generation reticent to take over. So more just an observation. I don't have an answer for that either.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'll be just another thing to watch going forward, is how that impacts it. I do want to close out by just talking about your career path, because you and I've talked now a couple times, and you're actually interested in getting into the industrial real estate space in some capacity. And I know that you're talking to a number of people that you're connected with through your network, but you're considering development, you're considering a brokerage as well. So I really encourage you to do that, because I think it's clear and evident for anybody that's watching this that you offer a tremendous amount of value to the industry from your expertise and knowing all the different markets across the world that you've physically worked in, as well as just a breadth of experience. So I would really encourage you to consider getting into the industry. That'd be a detriment to the supply chain industry, which you'd be leaving, but you would just bring so much value and expertise. So I really would encourage you to look into that as well.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, Chad. I mean, you and I have had multiple conversations about this, and just the shared passion we have for the industrial space. And it's kind of funny, it's at one point, I remember when I was younger thinking to myself, why am I involved in this industry? And then you get older and you realize that you developed a passion for it. And especially for me right now, the industrial space. And so, being able to parlay your experience into these different areas has been a nice thing to consider. So I definitely, it's a passion. It's something I love reading about, looking at, and it just fascinates me. It's hard to explain to people why you're so interested in this space, but if you're in it and you love it, you just know why and you understand why, and it's one of those things.
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can reach something real quick. So I'm such a real estate nerd that I bought the Monopoly version of Prologis. They put
this wow! You know what? I got to buy that. I didn't know that was out there.
You got to go on eBay. You can find them on eBay pretty easily. I wanted one that was factory sealed because I'm full on nerd, and I just figured one that was open wasn't going to be as good. But I'm exactly like you. I'm just an industrial real estate enthusiast, and I just love talking about it, and I love chatting with guys like yourself as well. So I've always said that I get the most benefit from these podcasts because you just get to talk to awesome people like yourself. So I really want to thank you, Matt, and we're going to chat after this as well. But I want to thank you for jumping on, and I'd also encourage people to reach out to you on LinkedIn. I believe that we have that in the notes, and I'll also add that as a comment and pin it after this as well.
Yeah,
and I know you're very eager and enthusiastic to talk about industrial real estate, so people can reach out to you and ask questions if they have anything to chat with you about.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. I would love that. Yeah, I one of the things I love is connecting with people and getting the chance. I'm like you. I love talking to people about this, whether they be directly involved or indirectly. I really enjoy it. So I think, life is about connections and about relationships. Absolutely. And about building those networks. And without those, you can't go very far. So I love doing that. And I would love to talk to anybody that wants to reach out for sure. Yeah, I would love that.
That's a great note to end on. I was going to ask you to end saying something in Spanish or German, but I'll save putting you on the spot to that. Yeah. And instead just ask people if you enjoyed this, please hit the thumbs up button. Again, connect with Matt, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.